My 6-year-old grandson beat his fists against his own front door until his knuckles split, screaming, "Daddy, it's cold! Please, Daddy, open it!" And on the other side of that door, my son-in-law turned up the Christmas music. I know because I watched it. 40 minutes later, on the porch camera I installed for them, my daughter stood in the freezing rain, holding 4 garbage bags with her whole life in them. Ethan wasn't panicking. He wasn't drunk. He was calm. 30 years working homicide taught me one thing. Nobody is that calm unless he thinks he's already won. So I stopped asking why he did it. I started asking what he knew, and that question ended him. Before we go further, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled. And if you believe a man should never lock a child out in the cold, subscribe and stay with me. Because the door he locked that night, it was the last door he ever closed on his own terms. My name is Samuel Brooks. I'm 68 years old, and for 31 of those years I carried a badge in Portland, 22 of them in homicide. People hear that and they picture something loud, car chases, kicking in doors. It was never like that. The job was mostly waiting, sitting across a table from a man who was lying to my face and letting him lie, letting him build the whole beautiful house of it brick by brick, because a man who's lying always builds a house too big for the lot. Always. And then you just ask him real quiet about one window that doesn't match. That's the whole trick. That's 31 years. Find the window that doesn't match. I retired at 62 and moved out to a little town on the Oregon coast, where the fog comes in like it's got a grudge, and the nearest traffic light is 19 miles inland. Bought a gray house with a bad roof and fixed the roof myself badly. My wife Elaine died 4 years before that, and I won't pretend I moved out here for the ocean. I moved out here because our house in Portland had a kitchen in it, and in that kitchen, there was a place where she used to stand, and I couldn't walk past it anymore. So small house, bad roof, coffee at 5 a.m., because the body doesn't forget the shift schedule even after the badge is gone. That was my life. That was the whole of it. And I want you to understand, I was fine with it. I'd made my peace. I figured the last chapter of my life was going to be quiet. Then, on the 11th of November, at 11:40 at night, in the worst storm we'd had in 6 years, somebody started pounding on my front door. I want to be precise about this part because I've gone over it maybe 4,000 times since. I was asleep in the chair, television on muted, rain coming sideways off the water so hard it sounded like gravel on the windows. And under that noise, pounding. Not knocking, pounding. Flat of the hand, fast the rhythm of somebody who's got no plan past, get inside. I was up before I was awake. That's a thing the job leaves in you and never takes back. I opened the door and my daughter was standing on my porch in the rain. Rachel, 34 years old, 2nd grade teacher, my kid. She was soaked all the way through hair, flat to her skull, wearing a cardigan. A cardigan in November on the Oregon coast in a storm, and she had my grandson on her hip, like he was 2 years old instead of 6, his arms locked around her neck, his face buried in her shoulder. Behind her in the driveway, her car door was hanging open with the dome light on and the rain going into it because she hadn't even stopped to close it. And her mouth was moving, but nothing was coming out. I've seen shock. I've seen it on mothers in doorways at 3 in the morning. I've seen it on men in interview rooms when the last lie falls off. I knew what I was looking at. Rachel. I got a hand on her arm. Rachel, look at me. Are you hurt? She shook her head. Is Noah hurt? She shook her head again, and then something in her face came apart and she said, Dad. And that was all she managed. Just that. Dad. 34 years old, and she said it like she was 9. I brought them in. Shut the door on the storm. And Noah still wouldn't lift his head off her shoulder. My grandson, who normally hits me in the stomach at a dead run the second I walk in a room, who once talked to me for 50 minutes straight about a lizard, Noah wouldn't look at me. That was the first thing that scared me. Not the rain, not her face. The kid wouldn't look at me. Take the chair by the fire, I said. Don't argue. I'm getting towels. Dad, I'm getting the chair wet. I've got 100 chairs. You have 4 chairs. Then I've got 4 wet chairs. Sit. That's the thing nobody tells you about a crisis. You don't say anything wise. You say, sit down and here's a towel, and I'm putting the kettle on, because those are the only sentences that fit in your mouth. I got a towel around Noah first. He was shivering hard enough that his teeth were going, and he still had his fists closed up tight in his mother's cardigan. And when I tried to lift him, she said quick and sharp, "He won't, Dad, he won't let go. He hasn't let go since—" She stopped. "Since when, honey?" She didn't answer. I crouched down. 68-year-old knees, so it's less a crouch and more a controlled collapse. Got my face level with his. "Noah, hey, it's Grandpa." Nothing. "You know what I got in the freezer? I got those popsicles. The blue ones your mom says rot your brain." Nothing. And then barely he turned his head maybe an inch, and I saw one eye, and my grandson looked at me the way people look at you when they're deciding whether you're going to be another thing that hurts. 6 years old. Something happened in my chest right then that I'm not going to try to describe because I've been a cop and cops are bad at that, and because if I describe it, I'll have to feel it again. I just said, "You're safe here, buddy. Nobody comes in this house I don't let in." And he looked at me for another second, and then he put his head back down. But his fist came loose, just a little. That was enough for right then. It took an hour to get them warm. I put Noah in my bed with 3 blankets on him, and the little lamp on, because when I reached for the light switch, he made a sound, and Rachel said, "Leave it. Leave the light on, please." So I left the light on. Then I came back out, and my daughter was sitting on my couch, in a pair of my sweatpants, rolled up 6 times at the ankle, and one of my old flannel shirts holding a mug of tea. She wasn't drinking, and she was staring at the fire. I sat down across from her. Didn't say anything. That's the other trick. The one everybody thinks is a trick and isn't. You don't ask, you wait. People want to tell you. They've been carrying it, and it's heavy, and the only thing they want in this world is to put it down. Your job is to be the floor. So I was the floor, for 11 minutes. I watched the clock. And then Rachel said without looking at me, "He brought her into the house, Dad." "Tell me," I said. "You're going to be angry." "Probably. Tell me anyway." She turned the mug around in her hands. "Her name is Vanessa." And then she told me. And I'm going to tell it the way she told it, because the order matters. The order always matters. 6:15 in the evening. Rachel gets home from parent-teacher conferences. Long day. That's the day where you tell 11 sets of parents that their kid is doing fine, and 2 sets of parents something harder. And she'd had one of the hard ones, and she was worn down to the frame. She pulls in. There's cars in the driveway. Her mother-in-law's Buick, Ethan's aunt's minivan, a silver Lexus she doesn't recognize. Her first thought, and this is my daughter. This is exactly my daughter. Her first thought is, did I forget something? Is it somebody's birthday? She sits in the car for a second, doing the math on the calendar because her instinct when something's wrong is that it's her fault. She goes in. Coats on the hooks, lights on, music on Ethan's playlist, the one he does for parties. And Noah is sitting at the bottom of the stairs, alone, in his coat, with his backpack on. She says, "Baby, why do you have your coat on?" And Noah says, 6-year-old Noah says, "Daddy said we're going on a trip." Rachel stops right there in the telling. Stops for maybe 15 seconds. And then she keeps going, and her voice has gone completely flat, which is a thing I've heard maybe 200 times in interview rooms, and it never once meant the person was calm. She walks into her own living room. There's 8 people in it. Ethan, his mother Diane, his aunt, 2 cousins, a neighbor couple, and a woman she's never seen before sitting on Rachel's couch in Rachel's living room with her legs crossed and a glass of Rachel's wine in her hand. And the whole room goes quiet. Not surprised quiet. That's what Rachel said to me, and this is where I sat forward because my daughter is not a detective, but she is a woman who has spent 12 years reading a room full of second graders, and she knows the difference between oops and finally. She said, "Dad, they weren't surprised. They were waiting." Every one of those people knew. They'd been sitting in her house drinking her wine waiting for her to walk in. "What did he say?" I asked. He said, She stopped, started again. He said, Rachel, good, sit down, we need to talk about the arrangements. The arrangements. That's the word. That's the exact word. I filed it. Arrangements. That's not a word from a fight. That's a word from a meeting. Fights don't have arrangements. Fights have screaming and slammed doors, and you never, and I always. Arrangements have an agenda. And then he introduced her. Rachel laughed. One syllable, no humor in it at all. He introduced her dad. He stood up and he put his hand on her shoulder and he said, This is Vanessa. Vanessa's going to be living here now. We're all adults. There's no reason this has to be ugly. I sat very still. In front of Noah. Noah was on the stairs. In front of Noah, Rachel. Noah was on the stairs, Dad. I need to say something here. There is a version of this story where I stand up at this point in the telling and I put my fist through the drywall. I've thought about that version a lot. Some nights I still visit it. But I didn't do that. And I want to tell you why honestly, because it isn't because I'm a good man. It's because in 31 years I learned exactly one thing worth knowing, and it's this: rage is a gift you hand your enemy, every time. A man who's angry makes noise, and noise tells the other guy where you are. A man who's angry says the true thing out loud, and now the other guy knows what you know. A man who's angry breaks the one object in the room that was evidence. I have watched more men lose everything in the 90 seconds after they got angry than I have ever watched lose it to bad luck. So I sat there with my hands flat on my knees and I said, okay, what happened next? And Rachel looked at me, and here's the thing she'd been waiting for: the explosion too. I think she'd driven 90 minutes in a storm partly for the explosion, and when it didn't come, something in her shoulders came down a half inch. You're not yelling, she said. No. Why aren't you yelling? Because I'm listening, I said. There's a difference between those two things, and it's the reason I had a job for 31 years. What happened next, honey? She refused. That's what happened next, and I want that on the record, because when this story got told later, and it got told a lot later by people with agendas, the version they pushed was that Rachel fell apart, that she got hysterical, that she was unstable, which is a word certain men reach for, the way other men reach for a hammer. She didn't fall apart. She said no. She said, this is my house. You can leave. She can leave. All of you can leave. And Diane, the mother-in-law, 61 years old. Church 3 times a week. Diane stood up off Rachel's couch and said, Sweetheart, don't make a scene. It's his house. It's our house. Rachel. Diane's voice, Rachel said, was kind. That's what she kept coming back to. It was kind. Rachel, honey, your name isn't on anything. Right there is where I stopped being a father, listening to his daughter, and started being something else. Because I have sat across the table from 140 guilty people, and I am telling you, guilty people, rehearse. That's not a line you improvise. That's not a thing that comes to you in the heat of it, standing in a living room. Your name isn't on anything. That's a line somebody's checked. That's a line somebody said out loud in a car on the way over to somebody else, and the other person said, don't say that, and she said it anyway. I said very carefully, Rachel, say that again. Exactly. What? What Diane said, word for word. She frowned at me. She said, your name isn't on anything. And what did Ethan do when she said it? What do you mean, what did he do? His face, I said. When his mother said that sentence. What did his face do? And my daughter, God bless my daughter. My daughter closed her eyes and went back into that room and looked at him, and she said, he winced. I sat back. He winced. She said again, slower, hearing it herself. Like she'd said too much. Dad, like she'd said too much. I said, yeah. Dad, what does that mean? It means, I said, that we're going to need a bigger table. Here's what happened over the next 40 minutes in my daughter's house, and I'm going to try to get through it in one pass. Rachel said no. Ethan explained in a reasonable voice in front of 8 people that she was being emotional. Rachel said, get out of my house. Ethan said, "Mom." And Diane, 61 years old, church 3 times a week, walked upstairs to Rachel's bedroom and started opening drawers. They had garbage bags. They brought garbage bags. I want you to sit with that because I did for a long time that night in a chair at 2 in the morning. This wasn't a fight that got out of hand. Nobody grabs a box of contractor bags in the middle of a fight. Those bags were bought. Somebody stood in an aisle at a store and picked them up and put them in a cart and paid for them, thinking about this exact evening. Rachel's clothes, Rachel's shoes, Rachel's books, Noah's dinosaurs, which he'd lined up on his windowsill in an order that mattered enormously to him and to no one else on earth. Into bags. Aunt carrying. Cousin carrying. Neighbor couple standing in the hall not carrying anything and not leaving either. Which, I'll be honest, is the part I have the hardest time with. Not the ones who did it, the ones who watched. And Rachel is following them room to room, saying, "Stop," saying, "These are my things," saying, "Ethan, look at me, look at me. Ethan?" And he wouldn't. That's what she said. He never looked at her once. He stood by the fireplace with his phone in his hand. And then Noah started crying. And that's when Ethan finally spoke. He said, and I am quoting my daughter, quoting him, "Rachel, you're upsetting him. Take him outside and calm him down." She went out, with Noah, to calm him down, and the door shut behind her, and the lock turned. She stood on her own porch and knocked. Then she knocked harder. Then she rang the bell, her own doorbell. She rang her own doorbell in the freezing rain with her son crying, and she could hear them inside. She could hear the music. She could hear somebody laugh. And Noah got away from her. 6 years old, he got away from her, and he ran up to that door, and he hit it with both fists, and he screamed, "Daddy, Daddy, it's cold. Daddy, please." And nobody opened it. The bags came out onto the porch. 4 of them. Aunt opened the door. 6 inches pushed them out with her foot and shut it again. 6 inches. That's how far that door opened. 6 inches for 4 garbage bags and not for a 6-year-old. Rachel stopped talking. It was 2:15 in the morning. The fire had gone down to almost nothing, and neither of us had gotten up to fix it. And I said the only thing I could think of. I said, "How long?" She said, "What? How long were you on the porch before you got in the car?" And she looked at the floor and she said, 40 minutes. I got up and put a log on the fire. Took me a while. My hands weren't doing what I told them. 40 minutes, in November, on the coast, with a 6-year-old. You know what 40 minutes is? 40 minutes is not an impulse. An impulse burns out in 90 seconds. You slam a door in a rage, and 40 minutes later you're sick about it. You're opening that door, you're saying, "Come inside." I didn't mean it. 40 minutes is plenty of time for a human conscience to make one lap. 40 minutes with the music on means nobody in that house was in a rage. 40 minutes means everybody in that house had decided. I stood there with my back to my daughter, and I did something I'm not proud of, which is that for about 6 seconds, I let myself think about Ethan's face and my hands, and what would happen, and how much it would cost me. And I did the arithmetic all the way to the end, all the way to Noah visiting me, somewhere with a phone and a piece of glass between us. And then I put the log on the fire, and I turned around and I said, "Okay, I want to ask you a few things, and some of them are going to sound cold. Can you do that?" She wiped her face with her sleeve. "Yeah." "Whose money bought that house?" "Mine, mostly. The down payment. That was Mom's." She stopped. "That was the money Mom left me. All of it. Most of it. 60-something thousand. You wire it or write a check. Dad. Wire or check, honey?" "I don't wire, I think. Ethan handled it. He handled all of that." I nodded slowly. "Who pays the mortgage?" "Both of us. It comes out of the joint account." "Both your paychecks go in there?" "Yes." "When's the last time you looked at the balance?" Silence. I turned around. She was looking at me with an expression I'd only ever seen on the other side of a table. "Rachel, when's the last time you looked at your own bank account?" And she said very quietly, "He does the money, Dad. He's always done the money. He said I've got enough to worry about with school and Noah, and he'd handle it, and it was nice. It was nice not to have to—" And then she stopped because she heard it. She heard exactly what she'd just said. She said, "Oh." That's all. Just "oh." Now here's where I have to tell you about Ethan, and I have to be fair about it, and I don't want to be. I liked him. That's the truth. I liked him. 11 years ago, he sat in my kitchen in Portland, 26 years old, decent haircut, called me sir, until I told him to knock it off, and he asked me for my daughter's hand, which nobody does anymore. And he was so nervous, his knee was going 100 miles an hour under my table. And I'd checked him out. Of course I checked him out. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I ran him. Clean, nothing. Not so much as a parking ticket. Elaine said to me that night, "Well," and I said, "He's fine. He's a nice kid." And my wife, who was smarter than me by a distance I have never been able to measure, my wife said something I didn't understand for 11 years. She said, "Sam, he watches you when you're not talking to him." I said, "What's that supposed to mean?" She said, "I don't know yet." Elaine died 3 years later, and I never got to ask her again, and I've thought about that sentence probably once a week since November 11th. He watches you when you're not talking to him. Yeah. He did. He surely did. At 3 in the morning, Rachel finally went to lie down with Noah, and I sat in my kitchen with a legal pad. Old habit. When I can't sleep, I make a timeline. Left column time. Right column fact. Not conclusion fact. The number of cases I've watched fall apart because a good cop wrote a conclusion in the fact column would break your heart. So 6:15 p.m. R arrives home. 8 people present. Not surprised. 6:15 p.m. Noah in coat backpack on. Told, "Trip. Stop. Look at that." The kid had his coat on before Rachel got there. Somebody dressed that child for the outside before his mother walked through the door. Somebody looked at a 6-year-old and put his little shoes on him and packed his backpack. That's not an argument that escalated. That's logistics. I wrote in the right column planned, not less than 1 week. Then I crossed out 1 week because I didn't know that, and conclusions don't go in the fact column, but I'd already thought it. And I was right, and I want to be honest. I was right about the week, and I was wrong about the scale, wrong by a factor I couldn't have guessed at 3 in the morning with a legal pad. It wasn't a week. It was 14 months. 7 o'clock-ish p.m. bags. Contractor grade. Brought, not found. 7:20 p.m. R and N put out. Door locked. 8 o'clock p.m. bags pushed out. Door opens 6 inches. And then I sat there, and I tapped the pen on the pad for a while, and I wrote the sentence that changed everything, and it wasn't clever. It was the most obvious sentence in the world, and it's the one nobody was asking because everybody was busy asking the interesting question. The interesting question is, how could he do that to his own son? That question feels enormous. It feels like the center of everything. And it is a completely useless question because it has no answer that gets you anywhere. It just makes you feel things. The useful question is smaller and uglier. I wrote, why isn't he afraid? Because think about it with me for a second. Just think it through like a man with a legal pad at 3 a.m. Say you're a 36-year-old regional operations manager. You make $110 a year. Your name's on a mortgage. You've got a kid and a wife and a life. And you decide, God help you, that you want out. You want the other woman, you want the new life, you're going to burn it down. Fine. Men do that every day. It's the oldest and stupidest story on earth. But how do you do it? You do it quiet. You do it with a lawyer. You do it with a story about how you both grew apart. You absolutely do not do it in front of 8 witnesses. You do not do it with your mother carrying the bags. You do not lock a 6-year-old outside in a rainstorm for 40 minutes where, and here's the part that kept me up, where there was a camera. I installed that camera 2 Christmases ago. It saves clips. It saves them to an account. He knew that camera was there. He knew, and he did it anyway in front of 8 people with his mother as a witness. That is not a man who's out of control. That is a man who is not afraid of consequences. And in 31 years, I have only ever met two kinds of people who aren't afraid of consequences. The first kind is crazy. The second kind knows something you don't. I wrote it on the pad at the bottom and underlined it twice. He isn't afraid. Why? And then under that, Diane. Your name isn't on anything. E winced. And I looked at those two lines sitting next to each other on a yellow legal pad in a kitchen in a town of 1,100 people, and something went cold and quiet and familiar in me for the first time in 6 years. Because that's the window that doesn't match. Ethan didn't wince because his mother was cruel. Cruel was the whole point of the evening. Cruel was on the agenda. He winced because she said a fact out loud in front of a room. And a man only winces at a fact if the fact is load-bearing. I made coffee at 5 out of habit and drank about a third of it. At 6:40, Rachel came out. She hadn't slept either. Her eyes were swollen half shut, and she was wearing my flannel, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Dad, I need to call him." "No. He has to let us get our—" "Rachel." I put the cup down. "Sit." She sat, and I turned the legal pad around and pushed it across the table to her. She read it. Took her a minute. Then she looked up and said, "I don't understand." "I know," I said. "Look at the last two lines." She read them again. "Dad, I still don't." "Honey, listen to me. Everybody in your life for the next 6 months is going to tell you this is a story about a woman named Vanessa." I tapped the pad. "It isn't. I don't care about Vanessa. Vanessa is a decoy." "A decoy. A man who wants to leave you for another woman leaves." I said it as gently as I know how, which isn't very. He doesn't need 8 witnesses. He doesn't need his mother. He doesn't need to lock a child out where a camera can see it. All of that costs him. All of that is expensive. So, I turned the pad back around. Why'd he pay for it? She stared at me. "There's only one reason you humiliate somebody in front of a room," I said. "You do it so they run, so they take the kid, and they go, and they never come back, and they never ever look." And I watched it land on my daughter's face. "Look at what?" she whispered. "That's the question," I said. "That's the only question." She didn't say anything for a long time. Outside, the storm had blown itself out, and there was that flat gray light coming up off the water, and you could hear Noah breathing in the next room, which is a sound I would trade almost anything to hear again, exactly like that. Then Rachel said, "The refinance." I went very still. "Say that again." "There was a dad, it was nothing. It was like a year and a half ago. He said the rate dropped and we should refinance, and it'd save us like $400 a month." She was talking fast now. "He put papers in front of me at like 10 o'clock at night, and I was grading and I just—" "You signed them." "I signed them. It was Dad." It was one page. He flipped to the page with the line on it, and I signed it, and I went back to grading. I didn't. And then she stopped, and she went white. I said, "What? Dad?" Her voice had gone strange. "Dad, I signed once." "Okay." "But in March, the mortgage company sent a welcome packet, a second welcome packet, and I said, 'What's this?' And he said it was junk mail. It was a mistake. They send those to everybody." She looked up at me. "Dad, why would there be two?" And I sat in my kitchen on the 12th of November with my coffee going cold, and my daughter across the table, and my grandson asleep in the next room with the lamp on, because he was afraid of the dark now. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 6 years, and had honestly figured I'd never feel again. Not rage. I want to be clear about that. Rage would have been easier, and I'd have been done inside a week in a cell, and Ethan would have won. What I felt was that thing that used to come at about hour 30 of a bad case. That flat, cold, patient click when the noise stops, and the room goes quiet, and you realize you're not looking at a tragedy anymore. You're looking at a structure. And structures have a load-bearing wall. Every single one. Somewhere in the middle of it, there's one piece holding the whole thing up, and it's never the piece anybody's looking at. It's never the mistress. It's never the door. It's a signature on a page at 10 o'clock at night, while a woman grades second-grade spelling tests. I said, "Rachel." "Yeah." Do you still have your login for the county assessor's site? For the what? Never mind. I got up and got my keys off the hook by the door. My hands were steady now. First time all night. Get your coat. Dad, where are we going at 7 in the morning? Salem, I said. Recorder's office opens at 8:30. She stared at me. Why? And I stood in my doorway, the same doorway she'd pounded on 8 hours before, soaked to the bone with my grandson on her hip, and I said the thing I'd been turning over all night. The thing that turned out to be the truest sentence I have ever said in my life. Because he made one mistake, honey. He thought the worst thing that could happen to him was you being angry. I opened the door. He locked us out, Dad. He didn't leave us anything. He left a paper trail, I said. That's not nothing. That's everything. She got her coat. She didn't ask again why, and that's the part I keep coming back to, because my daughter had been awake for 26 hours, and she'd been thrown out of her own house, and she had every right in the world to sit down on my floor and stop. Instead, she stood in my doorway and said, Noah. Mrs. Kessler down the road. She raised 4 boys and she's up at 5. He'll have pancakes inside of 10 minutes. Dad, he won't stay with a stranger. He won't even let go of my... Then we'll find out. I said, but I'm not lying to you. If we go now. That office opens at 8:30, and there's 110 miles of road between here and it. She looked at me for a second, and I watched her decide to be a different person than she'd been the night before. Okay, she said. Noah cried when she handed him over. I want that in the record too, because it cost her something to walk away from that sound, and she did it anyway, and everybody who later called my daughter weak should have stood in that driveway at 10 after 7 in the morning. We were on Highway 18 by 7:40. She didn't talk for the first 30 miles. Then, somewhere past the casino, she said, You're not going to tell me what we're looking for, are you? No. Why not? Because if I tell you what to look for, you'll find it, I said. That's not a compliment. That's how innocent men go to prison. She turned that over for a mile or so. So, what am I supposed to do? Read what's actually on the page. Not what you remember, not what he told you. What's on the page. That's it. Honey, that's the whole job. At 8:31, we were standing at a counter in Salem in front of a woman named Prisha, who had the specific patience of somebody who has explained the same thing 11,000 times. And I said, Ma'am, I need everything recorded against a property. Deeds, mortgages, reconveyances, releases, anything with a stamp on it. Address. Rachel gave it. Her voice caught on her own street name, and she covered it with a cough. You the owner? Yes, Rachel said. It's public record anyway, Prisha said, already typing. Anybody can pull it. People think it's secret. She hit a key, and the printer started somewhere behind her, and it kept going, and it kept going, and I watched Rachel's face change as it kept going. She said quietly, Why is it doing that for so long? Prisha came back with a stack. I want to say it was 40 pages. It was 36. There's a lot on this one, she said not unkindly, and set it down. And Rachel picked up that stack, and I watched my daughter, standing at a public counter at 8:40 in the morning on the 12th of November, read the top sheet. Then she read it again. Then she said, This is wrong. Okay. Dad, this is wrong. She was flipping. This says there's a mortgage recorded in June of last year for $280,000. Okay. Our mortgage is $190,000. She looked up. Our mortgage is $190,000. We bought the house for $245,000. I put $62,000 down. I know what our mortgage is. Keep going. She flipped, stopped, flipped back. There's another one. How much? March. Her hands had started shaking, and it wasn't the cold. March of this year. $340,000. I stood there and did arithmetic in a county office and felt the floor of it settle under me. Rachel. Dad, that's more than the house is worth. Rachel. I put a hand on the counter flat. The first one paid off the original. The second one paid off the first. Every time he did it, he took the difference in cash. She stared at me. How much? She said. I don't know yet. Dad, how much? I don't know, honey. Somewhere north of $150,000. And my daughter stood in a public building with 36 pages in her hands and said out loud to nobody, I make 51 a year. At 8:52, Prisha said, Ma'am, do you want a chair? Rachel said no. Rachel said no, thank you. And then Rachel sat down on the floor. I didn't pick her up. That was the hardest thing I did that week. I let her sit there for about 40 seconds because she needed 40 seconds. And then I crouched down next to her and I said, I need you to do one thing and then you can fall apart for as long as you want. One thing. What? Turn to the signature page. She found it. Page 9. And she went absolutely still. Rachel. She didn't answer. Rachel, is that your signature? And my daughter looked up at me with an expression I have never seen on her face before or since, and she said, It's better than my signature. I took the page out of her hands, and there it was. Rachel Ann Brooks. Clean, even all the letters present. Every single letter. I've watched my daughter sign things for 34 years. She signs her permission slips, her checks, her Christmas cards. The A in Ann is a hook. It's not an A. It's been a hook since she was 15 years old because she signs fast and she's always been in a hurry. This one had an A. I said, Whose name is on the witness line? She looked and she made a sound I'd rather not describe. Diane, she said. It's Diane. 9:04 in the morning. Public counter, Salem, Oregon. That was the moment this stopped being a divorce. I called Marcus Webb from the parking garage at 9:20. Marcus and I worked together for 11 years, and then he got smart and retired at 55 and started doing title work for people who could afford it. And I hadn't called him in 2 years, which is a thing I regret and can't undo. He picked up on the second ring and said, Sam Brooks, somebody died. My daughter's husband refinanced her house twice with forged paper, and I'm standing in a parking garage in Salem with 36 pages. There was a pause about 3 seconds long. Then Marcus said, Read me the recording numbers. I read them. I heard him typing. I heard him stop typing. Then Marcus said something I've known him 30 years and never heard him say, which was nothing at all, for about 8 seconds. Marcus. Sam, who's the lender on the second one? Cascade Pacific something. Cascade Pacific Funding, he said. Yeah, okay. What's okay mean? It means, Marcus said slowly, that Cascade Pacific is a broker, not a bank, and I've seen that name 3 times in 4 years, and 2 of those times somebody went to federal prison. Rachel was watching my face. I turned away from her, which she noticed, which I regret. Marcus talked to me like I'm a civilian. A bank has a compliance department. A broker has a guy. If your son-in-law had a guy at Cascade Pacific, then this isn't a man who forged his wife's name in a panic. He let that sit. This is a man who had help. At 9:31, I hung up the phone and Rachel said, What did he say? And I said, He said we're going to need a lawyer today. Not this week. Today. Her name was Miriam Okafor, and she had an office in a converted house in Portland, with a coffee stain on the ceiling that I stared at for 2 hours, and she was 50-something and had the flattest, calmest eyes I have ever seen on a person outside of a homicide unit. Marcus called ahead. She saw us at 1 o'clock, which is not a thing family attorneys do. She read the whole stack. All 36 pages. She didn't say a word for 19 minutes, and Rachel started to talk twice, and I put a hand on her arm both times. Then Miriam took her glasses off and said, Mrs. Whitaker. Brooks. Rachel said, I want to be Brooks. Miriam didn't even blink. Ms. Brooks, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it fast and not think about it. When you signed the paper in the kitchen at 10 at night, how many pages did he show you? 1. Did you see the top of the document? No. Was it stapled? Rachel opened her mouth, closed it. It was a stack, she said. It was a stack with one of those tab things, the little colored arrow. Sign here. Miriam wrote something down. Ms. Brooks, do you know what he did to you? He cheated on me. No, Miriam said. He cheated on you in October. That's the least interesting thing in this file. She turned the stack around. In June of last year, he committed felony mortgage fraud. In March of this year, he did it again, larger. He needed your signature both times, and he did not have it either time. Do you understand what that means? Rachel said. That he lied. That he forged, Miriam said. There's a very large difference, and the difference is roughly 20 years. I watched my daughter hear the word 20. And then I watched something I didn't expect, which is that she said, he's Noah's father. Miriam said, yes, he's Noah's father. Ms. Brooks, I'm going to say one thing about that, and then I'm never going to say it again, because it's not my business, it's yours. Miriam leaned forward. You didn't do this to him. Every single person in your life is going to talk to you like you're the one holding the hammer. You're not. He built this. He built it for 14 months. You're just the first person who read it. 2:40 in the afternoon. That's when my daughter stopped crying about her marriage and started paying attention. 14 months, Rachel said. You said 14. Why 14? And Miriam smiled just barely, and I thought, oh, she's good. Because the first fraudulent recording is dated June 9th of last year, Miriam said, and nobody's first forgery is on the day they get the idea. Here's the part I have to tell straight, because it's the part that later turned out to be everything. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Miriam said, I need the bank statements. Rachel said, I don't have them. Then get them. I can't. Dad, tell her he does the money. It's all on his phone. It's his email. It's all Ms. Brooks. Miriam said, whose name is on the joint account? Silence. Both of ours, Rachel said slowly. Then it's your account. But he told you it was his account, Miriam said. That's not the same as it being his account. Walk into that branch tomorrow morning with your driver's license and ask for 18 months of statements. They have to give them to you. They have to give them to you today if you ask right. Rachel said, that's it. And Miriam said, Ms. Brooks, 90% of financial abuse is somebody telling a woman she can't do a thing she is legally entitled to do at any time. It works because it's rude to check. I have thought about that sentence probably 400 times since. It works because it's rude to check. She walked into the branch at 9:05 the next morning. I sat in the car because Miriam told me to, and Miriam was right, and I hated it. She came out at 9:52 with a manila envelope, and she got in the passenger seat, and she shut the door, and she didn't say anything. Rachel. He moved $41,000 out of our savings on the 4th of November, she said. 7 days before he threw us out. Where'd it go? An account I've never heard of. And Dad... She stopped. It says the account was opened in February. 9:54 in the morning, 13th of November, in a parking lot outside a bank branch. My daughter looked at me and said the first genuinely cold sentence I ever heard out of her mouth. She said, he's been robbing me for a year and a half, and I made him dinner. Now the messages. Because he started texting her that afternoon. And I want you to understand what those messages did, because they didn't do what he thought they'd do. The first one came at 2:11. Rachel showed me. It said, I hope you've had time to think. You're being irrational, and it's affecting Noah. The second one 20 minutes later. My attorney says you have no claim on the house. I'd rather not do this the hard way. The third one that night at 10:40. You have 3 days to come get your things, or they go to Goodwill. Nobody's going to take your side on this, Rachel. Everybody saw you. And I read those, and I felt that click again, and I said, honey, look at me. He's scared. He's not scared. He's gloating. No. I handed the phone back. A man who's won doesn't send you a text at 10:40 at night. Winners don't need you to agree with them. He's texting you because he needs to know what you're doing. I tapped the screen. Read that last one again. What's he actually asking? She read it, and she said slowly, he's asking if I'm going to fight. He's asking if you looked, I said. That's not a threat, Rachel, that's a question. She stared at the phone. So what do I say? Nothing. Nothing. Not one word. I said it hard, because this was the whole thing, this was the entire hinge of it. Rachel, listen to me. Every hour he doesn't hear from you, he has to imagine what you're doing. And I promise you, whatever he imagines is worse than the truth, because he knows what he did. Guilty men have the best imaginations on earth. Silence is the only weapon we've got that costs us nothing. She said, That's cruel. Yeah, I said. It is. She didn't answer him. Not that day, not the next, not for 19 days. And on day 4, the texts changed. Day 1, you're irrational. Day 4, Rachel, can we talk? Just us? No lawyers. I think there's a lot of stuff that's gotten misunderstood. Day 6, I know I handled this badly. Day 8 at 2 in the morning. Please answer me. I showed that one to Marcus over the phone, and Marcus laughed for about 15 seconds and then said, Sam, he's checking the door. Yeah, he's walking around the house checking if the doors are locked. Yeah. You know what that means. It means somebody told him what a title search costs, I said. Marcus stopped laughing. Now here's the thing I got wrong, and I got it wrong big, and I've had to live with it. I thought I had time. I was building it the way you build a case patient. Brick by brick timeline, and documents, and a lawyer. All of it clean. All of it airtight because I have watched 100 good cases die from a rush. So I was going slow. And on the 18th of November at 4:15 in the afternoon, Rachel's phone rang while she was folding laundry in my living room, and it was Noah's school, and it was the principal, and the principal said, Mrs. Whitaker, I'm sure this is just a mix-up. Your husband's here to pick up Noah, and he's saying you're aware. 4:15, 90 minutes away, and school lets out at 3:30, which means that call was already 45 minutes late. I have been in fear before, professionally. It's a very specific sensation, and it lives somewhere behind your sternum, and I hadn't felt it in 6 years, and I felt it in my living room holding a pillowcase. Rachel said, Is he there? Is he there right now? He's in the office, ma'am. He's got Noah's coat. And my daughter, who 2 weeks earlier had sat down on the floor of a county office, my daughter said in a voice I'd never heard, Do not let him take my son out of that building. There's a custody order. It was filed on the 14th. My attorney's name is Miriam Okafor, and I am hanging up and calling the police. There was a silence on that phone. Then the principal said, He told us there wasn't one. He lied, Rachel said. He's very good at it. I drove 90 miles in 71 minutes, and I will not be taking questions on that. He was gone by the time we got there. Left the second the office picked up the phone to dial the non-emergency line, which tells you everything, because an innocent man stays. An innocent man stands there and says, There's been a mistake, call whoever you want. Guilty men leave when the phone comes out. Every time. It's practically a diagnostic test. Noah was in the front office in a plastic chair with his backpack on his lap and a juice box, and when Rachel came through the door, he didn't run to her. He looked at her first. Checking. 6 years old, and my grandson checked whether it was safe before he moved. And that, not the money, not the 36 pages, not the forged A and N. That's the thing I couldn't get out of my head at 2 in the morning for the next 4 months. We got in the car and got about 6 miles down the road, and Noah said from the back seat in this small flat voice, Grandpa? Yeah, bud. Am I in trouble? I had to pull over. I want to be honest about what happened next, because this is where I stopped being a retired guy with a legal pad. I pulled into a gas station lot, and I sat there with my hands on the wheel, and Rachel got in the back with him, and I listened to my daughter explain to a 6-year-old that he was not in trouble, that nobody was mad at him, that his dad picking him up wasn't his fault, and I listened to him ask her twice whether they were going to have to sleep in the car. He'd been thinking about that for 7 days. He'd been doing that math in his head at 6 years old, and I called Miriam Okafor from that parking lot at 6:40 in the evening, and I said, I want everything, today, tonight. And Miriam said, Sam, we're 2 weeks from having the forensic. He tried to take the boy. Pause. Sam listened to me carefully. Did he take him? No. Then it's better than you think. And I need you to hear why. She was already moving. I could hear a drawer. A man who tries and fails has now told us what he's got. He went to that school without a lawyer, without a court order with a story. Sam, he's got no paper. If he had 1 page of legal cover, he'd have led with it. He didn't lead with it. He didn't have it. He doesn't have anything, Miriam said. That's what today was. Today was a man reaching for a weapon and finding out the drawers empty. I sat in that gas station lot with my grandson, asking about sleeping in the car, and I said, "Then why do I feel like this?" And Miriam said quiet, "Because you're not a detective right now. You're a grandfather. Those 2 men have different jobs, and you can only do one of them at a time, and Sam tonight do the other one. Go home." I went home. I made grilled cheese. I burned the first one. And at 11 that night after Noah was down, Rachel came out and sat across from me and said, "Dad, I want to ask you something, and I want the true answer." "Okay. Is he going to go to jail?" And I said, "Probably." "For how long?" "I don't know. Years." She nodded, looked at her hands. "Noah's going to be 9, she said. Or 12, or 14. She looked up. "And someday he's going to ask me what happened, and I'm going to have to tell him that Grandpa did it." That one landed on me harder than anything that happened in Salem. I said, "Yeah." "Is that Dad? Am I supposed to—" She stopped and started over. "Everybody keeps telling me I'm going to want revenge. Diane called me vindictive, and I hadn't done anything yet. I hadn't done one thing. I was folding laundry. Rachel! I don't want revenge," she said, and she was crying now, and she was furious about crying. "I want to be stupid again. I want to go back to not knowing. I liked it better. Is that pathetic?" And I sat there in my kitchen, and I thought about Elaine, and about how she'd have known exactly what to say, and about how there is no fair reason on earth that I'm the one who got left behind to answer this. So I told her the only true thing I had. I said, "Honey, I've told a lot of people the truth about somebody they loved. Every single one of them asked me to take it back. Not one of them wanted to actually go back." She wiped her face. "That's a terrible comfort," she said. "Yeah," I said. "It's the only one that's ever worked." Marcus called at 11:40, which is late for a man of 66 who goes to bed at 9. "Sam, you sitting?" "I'm standing in my kitchen." "Sit." I sat. I pulled the June note, Cascade Pacific. There's a notary block on the signature page. "Okay." "Notary's name is Kevin Marsh, commission out of Clackamas County." He paused. "Sam, I ran him. Kevin Marsh's commission was revoked in April of last year." I didn't say anything. "You hearing me? April of last year. And this document is notarized in June, 2 months after he was done being a notary. So the stamp's fake. The stamp's real," Marcus said. "That's what I'm telling you. The stamp is real, and the commission is dead, which means somebody used a dead stamp, which means Kevin Marsh either sold it or Kevin Marsh was there." I got up, and I walked to the window, and I looked at nothing at all. "Marcus?" "Yeah." "If Kevin Marsh was there," I said, "then there was a room." "There was a room," Marcus said, "with a table, and chairs, and people in them," Marcus said. "Sam, listen to me. This isn't a guy who forged his wife's name at his kitchen table at midnight. There was a closing. Somebody sat down in a room with paper and a stamp and a witness, and they all knew, and they all went ahead. And I stood at my window at 11:44 at night on the 18th of November, and I finally understood what had been bothering me since the first hour, since the legal pad, since he isn't afraid. Because I'd had it backwards. I'd been thinking about it as a man who did something and then had to hide it. But you don't hide something behind 8 witnesses. You don't hide something with your mother's signature on it. The reason Ethan wasn't afraid wasn't that he'd covered his tracks. It's that he'd never once in 14 months been alone. There'd been a room, and everybody in it had a reason to keep the door shut. I said, "Marcus, who else signed that page?" And he told me, and I sat down on my kitchen floor, 68 years old at 11:51 at night, because the name he gave me was not Diane Whitaker. It was a name I'd known for 30 years. Ray Delaney. Marcus said it, and then he stopped talking because Marcus knew exactly what he'd just done to me. I said, "Say it again." Raymond J. Delaney. Notary lines Kevin Marsh. But there's a second signature block on the last page, loan officer of record, and it's Ray. Ray's in insurance. Ray hasn't been in insurance since 2019, Sam. 11:53 at night. I'm sitting on my own kitchen floor with my back against the dishwasher and my knees up like a kid 68 years old. Because here's what Marcus didn't have to say out loud. Ray Delaney was my partner. Not a guy I knew. My partner. 6 years, two of them. On nights, the man who drove me to the hospital when Elaine's water broke because I was too shaky to hold a wheel. Ray Delaney carried my wife's casket. Ray Delaney stood in my kitchen in Portland 11 years ago at Rachel's engagement party with a beer in his hand. And in 2014, when Rachel and Ethan bought that house and Ethan sat at my table saying he didn't know anything about mortgages and everything online looked like a scam. I said, and I remember saying it. I remember the exact words. Talk to Ray. Ray's good people. Tell him you're mine. I put them together. I introduced my son-in-law to the man who forged my daughter's name. Sam. Marcus's voice came out of the phone on the floor next to me. Sam, you there? Yeah. Don't. Don't what? Whatever you're doing right now on the other end of this phone, Marcus said. Don't. 12:09 in the morning, and I said, Marcus, I sent them to him, and my voice did something I didn't authorize. You sent them to a guy you trusted in 2014. That's not the same sentence, and you know it isn't. Then why does it feel like the same sentence? Because it's midnight, Marcus said. Everything's the same sentence at midnight. Go to bed, call me at 7, and it'll be a different sentence. He was wrong. It was the same sentence at 7. Here's the part I've never told anybody. I didn't tell Rachel about Ray for 9 days. 9 days. I sat across from my daughter at breakfast 9 times, knowing the name and not saying it, and I told myself it was because the investigation wasn't ready, and it was a lie, and I knew it was a lie by day 3. I didn't tell her because I couldn't stand for her to know that the door had my fingerprints on it. Now I want to be fair to myself because I've beaten myself up enough on this, and it doesn't produce anything. There was a real reason, too. Miriam Okafor said something to me on the 20th in her office with the coffee stain over her head, and she said it slow so it'd stick. Sam, if you tell Rachel that Ray Delaney signed that page, what does she do? She calls him. She calls him, Miriam said. And in 11 minutes, Ray Delaney calls Ethan Whitaker, and in 20 minutes, there's a shredder running somewhere, and we lose the only thing we've got. And what have we got? Right now. She tapped the stack. We've got a man who thinks nobody's looked. 10:40 in the morning. 20th of November. I said, how long do you need? 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Miriam. Sam, you were a cop for 31 years. Tell me the truth. What's a rushed case get you? I hated her a little bit right then, which is how I knew she was worth what Marcus said she cost. So I sat on it, and the whole time it sat on me. He came to the house on the 24th of November, 24 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. I know because I was watching the clock waiting for a pot to boil, and I heard the tires. Rachel was at the store. Noah was on my floor with the dinosaurs, the ones we'd bought new, because his were in a bag somewhere in a garage in Beaverton, and he'd put them in an order, and he wouldn't tell me what the order meant, but it mattered. I looked out, and it was a silver Lexus. I said, Bud, I need you to go in Grandpa's room and shut the door and put the little lamp on. He looked up at me, and he went white, and he said, Is it Dad? And I said, It's nobody. It's a salesman. I lied to my grandson, right to his face. And he went, and he shut the door, and I heard the click of that lamp, and something in me went very quiet. I opened my front door and stepped out onto my own porch and pulled it shut behind me, and I stood between my son-in-law and my grandson. He said, Sam. I didn't say anything. Sam, can I come in? No. He put his hands up a little, palms out. Reasonable. Everything about him is reasonable. That's the thing people never understand about men like Ethan. They picture a monster. He's got a nice jacket, and he says, "Look, I get it," and he means shut up. I just want to talk to my son. You want to talk to your son? I said. Sam, come on. Say that again. What? Say the sentence again. I want to talk to my son. Say it and look at that door while you say it. He didn't. He said, "This has gotten out of hand." 4:27 in the afternoon on my porch. I said, "It has." I know you're angry. I'm not. Sam, you're standing outside your own house, so I can't come in. That's not anger, I said. That's policy. And there, right there, 4 seconds of something crossing his face before he put the nice jacket back on it. He said, "Look, I've made mistakes. Nobody's arguing that. But Rachel's telling people things that aren't true. And my mother's getting calls, and my job." Sam, people at my job. Who called your job? What? You said people at your job. Who called them? He stopped. And I watched a 36-year-old man realize he'd just told me that somebody was already asking questions and that he didn't know who, because it wasn't us. I want that clear. On the 24th of November, we hadn't called anybody. Miriam had filed a custody order and a lease pendens on the house, and nothing else. Not one phone call. Somebody else was asking. He said quickly, "It doesn't matter." "It kind of does," I said. "Sam." And he got closer and dropped his voice. And this is the part I'd been waiting for. This is the part I'd have driven 300 miles for. "Sam, listen to me. Whatever's in your head, this is a money thing. It's not a criminal thing. It's a marriage falling apart, and there's money in the middle of it, and lawyers make it ugly. Let's just be adults." I said, "Okay." He blinked. "Okay. Okay. Explain the June note to me." Silence. 4:31 in the afternoon. "Explain June 9th, I said. 280,000. Take your time." And Ethan Whitaker stood on my porch and did the thing every single one of them does. The thing I have watched 140 times across a table with a recorder running. Which is that he checked my face. He checked my face to see how much I had. And I gave him nothing. I gave him the face I gave to men who'd done unforgivable things. Polite, a little bored. He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And I said, "Ethan, son, I've been doing this since before you could read." He left. He got in the Lexus and he backed out, and he clipped my mailbox, which is the only thing he did all year that wasn't calculated, and I stood on my porch until the sound of the engine was gone. Then I went inside, and my grandson was standing in the hallway, not in the bedroom. In the hallway. He'd opened the door. He said, "Grandpa, was that a salesman?" And I got down on my knees and I said, "No, that was your dad, and I lied to you, and I'm not going to do it again, ever, even when it's bad." He looked at me a long time. Then he said, "Did you let him in?" "No." And Noah said, "Good." 6 years old. I don't know what to do with that. I still don't. Rachel came home at 5:10, and I told her. All of it. Except Ray. She stood in my kitchen with a bag of groceries she never put down, and she said, "He came here." "Yes. He came here to your house and you—" She stopped. "What did you say to him?" "I asked him about June 9th. "You what?" The bag went on the counter hard. "Dad, Miriam said we don't say anything. Miriam said don't call him. He came to me." "That's the same thing. It's not remotely the same thing." I said, "And here's why. 6 weeks from now, Miriam's going to walk into a room and say your husband committed fraud, and his lawyer's going to say he panicked, he was scared, he made a bad choice in a bad moment." I pointed out the window. That man just stood on my porch and lied about it, flat calm with his hands in his pockets 13 days after he locked his son outside. That's not panic. That's character. And I'm a witness now. Rachel stared at me. "You did that on purpose." "Yeah." "You baited him." "Yeah." "Dad." Her voice cracked. "You baited him on the porch while our son was in the bedroom." And that one got me, because she was right. I said, yeah. She turned around and put her hands on the counter and stood there. And then without turning around, she said, "What aren't you telling me? 5:19 in the evening, 24th of November. And I said, nothing. That's the worst thing I did in this whole story. Not the porch. That. Now Christmas. I want to be quick about it because I've noticed people want you to dwell on it, and I don't. Rachel put up a tree in my living room on the 8th of December, a bad tree, 4 feet from a lot outside a hardware store. We had exactly 9 ornaments, because all the rest of them were in a house in Beaverton, in a box in a closet, and my daughter bought a package of red balls at a drugstore, and hung them up and said, "There, it's a tree." Noah asked on the 9th whether Santa knew he'd moved. Rachel said yes. He said, "Are you sure? Because we didn't tell anybody." And Rachel said, "Yes, baby Santa knows." And then she went in my bathroom and ran the water for 11 minutes. On the 22nd of December, at around 9 at night, Rachel's cousin sent her a screenshot. I heard my daughter make a sound in the next room that I'd only heard once before on my porch in the rain. The photo was Ethan and Vanessa in Rachel's living room, in front of Rachel's tree. Not a tree, the tree. Rachel's ornaments. Rachel's grandmother's angel, the one Elaine gave her, the ceramic one, with the chip on the wing on top of that tree in that photo. And the caption said, "New chapter. Grateful for real family. Some people build, some people take." Rachel handed me the phone with a hand that was completely steady and said, "Read the caption." I read it. "Read it again." I read it again. And my daughter said, "He's calling me the taker." 9:11 at night, 22nd of December. She sat down on my couch, and she didn't cry. That's what scared me. She sat there for a long time, and then she said in a completely normal voice, "Dad, I want to hurt him." I said, "I know." "No. Listen to me. I don't mean court. I mean I want to drive to Beaverton right now, and I want to walk in there and I want—" She stopped, breathed. That's the first time in my whole life I've ever wanted to do something like that. And I'm 34. I said, "Yeah. Is that who I am now?" And I said the truest thing I had, which wasn't much. "Honey, that feeling's not a person. It's weather. It comes through and it goes. The only thing that matters is what you're holding when it passes." She said, "What are you holding?" And I said, 36 pages. She laughed. It was an awful laugh, but it was a laugh. And then Miriam Okafor called at 9:40 on the 22nd of December, which is not a night attorney's call, and she said 6 words. "Sam, Vanessa Reyes contacted my office." I stood up. "Say that again." 2 hours ago. Voicemail. She's asking whether the house is community property in Oregon. Miriam paused. "Sam, she used the word weather." So Ethan told her it was his, free and clear. She's not asking because she's greedy. She's asking because something didn't add up and she went looking and she doesn't want to be told she's crazy. I said, "Miriam, is this a trap?" "Maybe." "What do you do if it's a trap?" "I call her back," Miriam said, "and I don't say one single word about our case, and I let her talk for as long as she wants." I said, "You've done this before." "Sam," she said, "the other woman is the most underrated witness in American law. Nobody ever plans for her. She was in the room and everybody treats her like furniture." Christmas Eve, 4:50 in the afternoon, Miriam called back. I took it on the porch because Noah was inside. She said, "She talked for 51 minutes. And, Sam, I'm going to tell you 3 things, and I need you to sit down for the third." Go. 1. She's not the mistress. Miriam let that sit. Not the way you think. She met him in March. He told her he was separated. He told her the divorce was final in September. He's not divorced. He's not filed, Miriam said. There is no case. There's no petition. There's nothing. Sam, he told a woman he was divorced and then moved her into his wife's house. I said, "That's not a crime." "No," Miriam said. "But it's a pattern, and juries eat patterns for breakfast." 2. She's the one who called his job. I put a hand on my porch rail. On the 9th, Miriam said. She called his employer's HR line on the 9th of December because he told her the money for the boat came from a bonus, and she found a wire confirmation with a broker's name on it. Sam, she's been suspicious since November. 4:56 on Christmas Eve, and I said, Miriam, that's why he came to my porch. That's why he came to your porch, she said. He wasn't fishing you. He was bleeding. He didn't know who was pulling on him, and he came to the one person he thought he could read. I said, what's 3? And Miriam said, Sam, sit down. I'm 68. I don't sit down for people. Vanessa Reyes has a folder, Miriam said. Physical, paper. She's had it since the 11th of December. She said, and I'm quoting her because I wrote it down, she said, I made copies of everything the day I stopped believing him. I said, what's in it? She won't say on the phone. Miriam. She'll meet. She wants to meet Rachel. Absolutely not. Sam. Absolutely not, Miriam. She's not sitting across a table from the woman who... Sam. And Miriam's voice went somewhere I hadn't heard it go. Sam. I told her no too. And Vanessa Reyes said something to me, and I want you to hear it exactly. She said, he told me she abandoned the kid. He told me she left in the middle of the night and took nothing, and I sat there and I believed him, and then I found the garbage bags in the garage with the kid's dinosaurs in them. I couldn't say anything. She's not doing this for us, Miriam said. She opened a bag in a garage and found a 6-year-old's toys, and she has not slept since. They met on the 28th of December at 11 in the morning in a conference room in Portland, with Miriam sitting between them like a referee, and I sat in the hall because Rachel told me to, and I want to say that being told to sit in the hall by my own daughter was the proudest and worst 40 minutes of my life. I heard almost nothing through that door. At 11:38 it got loud once, one voice sharp and then quiet again, and I stood up and Miriam's paralegal put a hand out and said, Sir, sit down. At 11:52 the door opened. Vanessa Reyes came out first. 31 maybe. Not what I expected, and I'm ashamed of what I expected. She had a folder under her arm and her face was a wreck, and she stopped when she saw me. She said, You're the dad. Yeah. He talks about you, she said. I said, What does he say? And Vanessa Reyes looked at me and said, He says you're the only person who ever scared him. And then she walked out. Rachel came out at 11:55, and she was holding the folder. She didn't say anything in the elevator. She didn't say anything in the parking garage. She got in the car and she put the folder on her lap, and she put both hands flat on it, and she said, Dad, before I open this, I need to tell you something. Okay? She's not the villain. Rachel. Dad. She turned and looked at me. She sat in there and she apologized to me for 40 minutes, and I let her. I let her do it because I wanted to hear it. And about 20 minutes in, I realized I was making a woman apologize to me for something a man did, and Dad, I was enjoying it. I didn't say anything. That's what he does, Rachel said. That's the whole trick. He gets women to fight each other over the crime scene. And I looked at my daughter, 34 years old, second-grade teacher, sitting in a parking garage in Portland on the 28th of December, and I thought, God, Elaine, look at her. Look what you made. Then Rachel opened the folder, and the first page was a photograph of a document, a closing statement, and there were 4 signatures on the bottom of it, and one of them was Rachel's, the good one, the one with the A in Anne, and one of them was Raymond J. Delaney. And my daughter looked at it for about 3 seconds, and then she said in a voice with nothing in it at all, Dad, why is Uncle Ray's name on this? 12:04 in the afternoon. Parking garage level 2. I said, Rachel, don't. She was looking at the page. Don't do the voice. Don't do the voice you do. Honey, how long have you known? And I sat there. How long, Dad? I said, since the 18th of November. Silence. 6 weeks. That's what I'd taken from her. 6 weeks. She didn't yell. I almost wish she had. She said quietly, You sat at the table with me. Christmas. You watched me put the tree up. Yes. You let me tell you I didn't know who to trust anymore, and you let me say it. Yes. Why? And I told her the truth because I'd promised Noah in a hallway that I'd stop lying even when it was bad, and it turns out you can't make that promise to one person. I said, because I'm the one who told them to go to him. She turned and looked at me. In 2014, I said. Ethan asked me who to call about the mortgage, and I said Ray. I said Ray's good people. I said tell him you're mine. And my daughter sat there in a parking garage holding a folder that a woman she was supposed to hate had handed her. And she looked at her father, and I watched her decide. And she said, Dad, that's the stupidest thing you've ever said. I said, Rachel. No, listen to me. And she grabbed my arm. Listen, he didn't do it because you sent him. He did it because Ray Delaney sat in a room with a dead notary stamp and chose. You think you built that, Dad? You're not that important. I said, You're not that important, she said. And she was crying, and she was gripping my arm hard enough to hurt. You know who taught me that? You did, last month. You said guilty people rehearse. You said they build. So, who built it? Say it. I said he did. Who else? Ray? And who else? And I said Diane, Kevin Marsh, everybody in the room. And who wasn't in the room? I couldn't say it. She said it for me. You weren't in the room, Dad. 12:11 in the afternoon, and my daughter forgave me before I could finish confessing, which is a thing I have thought about every day since, and have never once deserved. Then she wiped her face, and she turned the page. And she stopped. And she said, Dad, what's this? It was an email, printed, dated the 2nd of November, 9 days before he threw them out, from Ethan Whitaker to Raymond Delaney. Subject line timeline. And the body was one sentence. Once she's out, and it's on paper that she left, how fast can we get the third one done? I read it 4 times, the third one. There was going to be a third refinance. He didn't throw my daughter out because he wanted Vanessa. He threw my daughter out so he could establish on paper in front of 8 witnesses that she had abandoned the house. The 8 people weren't an audience. They were witnesses. He was building a record, and every single one of them, his mother, his aunt, his cousins, the neighbors who stood in the hall and carried nothing. Every one of them thought they were watching a marriage end. They were signing a statement. I sat in that car and I heard myself say out loud, 40 minutes. Rachel said, What? The porch? I said, 40 minutes. He wasn't punishing you. She looked at me. He was making a timestamp, I said. Rachel didn't say anything for 11 seconds. I counted, because counting was the only thing my brain would still do. Then she said, A timestamp for what? For the third loan. I took the page out of her hands gently because my hands wanted to crush it. Rachel, think about what he needs. He's already borrowed more than the house is worth. Nobody's giving him another dollar on that property with your name on the deed and you living in it. So he needed me gone. He needed you gone and documented, I said. He needed 8 people who'd say under oath if it came to it that they watched Rachel Brooks walk out of that house on the night of November 11th. I didn't walk out. He locked me out. Honey, I put the page down. Every one of those people watched you go out that door with your son and your bags. Ask them a year from now what they saw. They'll say she left. And I watched my daughter understand at 12:14 in the afternoon on the 28th of December that she had been made into a document. She said, That's why he wouldn't look at me. What? On the stairs, in the living room. Her voice had gone thin. He never looked at me once. I thought it was guilt. She turned and looked at me. Dad, it wasn't guilt, was it? He was making sure it stayed clean. I didn't answer, which was an answer. We drove back to the coast, and neither of us turned the radio on. Somewhere around Grand Ronde, Rachel said, Miriam has to see this today. And I said, Miriam's seeing it in 20 minutes. I called her from the elevator. And Rachel said, You called her from the elevator. And I said, "Honey, I've been a cop for 31 years. I've never once walked out of a building without calling somebody from the elevator." She laughed. Once. It was the last time she laughed for a while. Miriam called at 4:40 that afternoon, and she'd read the whole folder, all of it 41 pages, and the first thing she said was, "Who else has seen this? You, me, Rachel, Vanessa." "Nobody else touches it," she said. "Sam, listen to me carefully. This is not a divorce file anymore. This is not even a fraud file. This is a conspiracy file." "Meaning?" "Meaning I can't take it," Miriam said. I stood up. "What?" "Sam, I'm a family attorney with 2 associates and a coffee stain on my ceiling. That email implicates a former licensed loan officer, a revoked notary, a broker with a compliance history, and a 61-year-old woman who signed as a witness on federally insured paper." She paused. "This is a federal case, and I don't get to file federal cases. I get to hand them to somebody." I said, "Who?" And Miriam said, "That's the part you're not going to like." 4:46 in the afternoon, 28th of December, and I found out that the mortgage fraud unit that would take this case was run out of Portland, and that the agent who'd catch it, a woman named Delgado, would take one look at the file and want to know who tipped them, which meant Vanessa Reyes. Which meant Vanessa Reyes was going to have to walk into a federal building and put her name on it. I said, "She won't." "Why not?" "Because she's living with him." Silence on the phone. Then Miriam said quietly, "Sam? Oh, Sam, you didn't ask." "Ask what?" "She moved out on the 12th of December, Miriam said. "The day after she opened the bag in the garage. She's been in her sister's spare room in Gresham for 16 days. I sat down. "Sam, he doesn't know she has the folder. He thinks she left because she got scared of the drama." Miriam's voice went very flat. "He's been texting her every day for 2 weeks trying to get her back." And I said, "Miriam, he's been texting Rachel too." Pause. "Since when?" I said, "Since the 2nd of December. Once every couple days. Please answer me. I know I handled this badly." And Miriam Okafor said, "Sam, he's not trying to get either of them back. He's trying to find out which one of them looked." Now here's where the whole thing nearly came apart, and it wasn't Ethan who did it. It was me. Because on the 2nd of January, at 9 in the morning, I got in my truck and I drove to Milwaukee, Oregon, to a house I'd been to maybe 40 times in my life, and I knocked on Ray Delaney's door. I didn't tell Miriam. I didn't tell Rachel. I told myself I was going to sit in the truck and watch the house for an hour and then leave, and I sat there for 14 minutes, and then I got out. He opened the door in a cardigan. That's what got me. A cardigan. Ray Delaney, who once put a man through a screen door in 1994 in a cardigan with a coffee cup. He saw me, and every bit of color went out of his face. And I want you to understand that in that second, that exact second, he did not say, "Sam, what a surprise." He said, "Aw, hell." 9:22 in the morning. I said, "Yeah." He stood there. Then he said, "You want to come in?" "No." "Sam." "Ray, if I come in that house, it's a conversation. If I stand out here, it's a visit." I put my hands in my pockets so he could see them. "I'm not wired. I'm not recording. There's nobody in the truck. Miriam Okafor doesn't know I'm here, and if she finds out, she'll skin me. This is just me." Ray Delaney looked at me for a long moment, and then he stepped out on his own porch and shut the door behind him, which, and I noticed it, and it hurt, is exactly what I'd done to Ethan. He said, "How much do you have?" And I said, "Ray, that's the wrong question, and you know it's the wrong question, and 30 years ago you'd have laughed at a guy who asked it." He closed his eyes. 9:25. "How's Rachel?" he said. "Don't." "Sam. Don't you say her name to me?" I said, and I heard my own voice, and I didn't recognize it, and that's when I knew I shouldn't have come. "You held her at the hospital. You were there, Ray. You held her when she was 4 hours old." And Ray Delaney said, "I know." "Then say it." "Say what?" "Say what you did." I stepped up. "You've got about 9 seconds where you get to be the guy who said it before somebody made him. That's it. That's the whole window, and it's closing while we stand here." And Ray Delaney, my partner, 6 years, 2 of them on nights, looked at me, and his mouth started to move, and I saw it. I saw the whole thing, right there at the front of his face, and then he looked past my shoulder at the street, and he said, "I want a lawyer, 9:27 in the morning, 2nd of January, to me, on his porch. He said, 'I want a lawyer,' to me, and I said, 'Ray, I'm not a cop anymore.' And Ray said, 'Sam, you never stopped being one for a single day of your life, and everybody knew it but you.' Then he went inside and shut the door. I sat in my truck outside that house for 20 minutes and did not turn the key, because he was right. That's the thing. He was right, and it was the truest thing anybody said to me the whole year, and it came out of the mouth of a man who forged my daughter's name. I called Miriam from a gas station in Oregon City at 10:05, and I said, 'I did something.' She listened to all of it without one word. Then she said, 'Sam, do you know what you just did?' 'Yeah.' 'You just told a co-conspirator that we're coming.' 'Yeah.' 'You may have just handed him 12 hours to call Ethan and start a fire.' 'I know.' And then Miriam Okafor was quiet for a second, and she said, 'And you also just did something I could never have done in 100 years. I said, 'What?' 'Sam, you made him refuse a lawyer's question with the word lawyer,' she said. 'On his own porch, to a man who isn't law enforcement. Ray Delaney's not scared of us. He's scared of what's already coming.' I said, 'Meaning somebody else already talked to him,' Miriam said. 'Sam, an innocent man, says, "What are you talking about?" A guilty man says, "How much do you have?" But a man who says, "I want a lawyer," on day 1 to a civilian," she let it hang. "That's a man who's already been warned." I gripped the wheel. "Who warned him?" "Sam," Miriam said, "go home. Right now. Go home and check on your daughter." I broke every speed limit between Oregon City and the coast, and Rachel was fine. Noah was fine. They were making pancakes at 1 in the afternoon for no reason, and I stood in my own doorway breathing like a man who'd run up a hill. Rachel said, "Dad, what's wrong?" And I said, "Nothing." And she said, "You promised Noah you'd stop doing that." And I looked at my grandson, who was standing on a chair at my counter with flour on his shirt, and I said, "Rachel, I went to see Ray." She turned off the burner. "Noah, honey, go pick a movie." He went. He didn't argue. He was getting good at that, and I hated it. Then my daughter turned around and said, "Tell me all of it." And I did. And when I finished, she stood there for a minute, and then she said something that knocked the wind out of me. She said, "Good." I said, "Good. He held me when I was 4 hours old," Rachel said, "and he sat in a room and signed my name, and for 2 months, the only version of him I had was a signature on a page. Now I know he opens the door in a cardigan and says, 'Ah, hell.'" She wiped her hands on a towel. "Dad, he knew. That's what you brought me. He didn't get confused. He didn't get tricked. He said, 'Ow, hell,' which means every day for 18 months he woke up and knew." I said, "That doesn't make it better." "No," she said. "It makes it simple." The call came on the 4th of January at 7:50 in the evening. Rachel's phone. Unknown number. She looked at me. I nodded. She answered on speaker and put it on the table between us, and neither of us breathed. A woman's voice said, "Rachel, it's Diane." And my daughter's whole body changed. I want you to understand something. Diane Whitaker had not called Rachel one single time since the 11th of November. 54 days. Not to ask about Noah, not on Christmas. Nothing. Rachel said, "Diane, sweetheart, I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to hear me out." And Rachel said, "Okay." "Some men came to my house today." 7:51 in the evening. I put my hand flat on the table. "They had badges," Diane said, and her voice was doing something I'd never heard it do. "And they asked me about a paper I signed, and I told them, Rachel. I told them, I don't know anything about any paper I sign. Things for Ethan all the time. He's my son, Rachel said. Diane. And they said something about a witness line and federal. They said federal. Diane. And Rachel, honey, I need you to call them and tell them I didn't know. You know I didn't know. You know me, sweetheart. 12 years. You know I'd never. And my daughter, 34 years old, second grade teacher sitting at my kitchen table on the 4th of January said, Diane, do you remember what you said to me in my living room? Silence on the line. Do you remember? Rachel, this isn't. You said your name isn't on anything. And Diane Whitaker said nothing at all for about 4 seconds. And Rachel said very quietly, How did you know that 753? How did you know my name wasn't on anything, Diane? Because I didn't know. I lived there. I paid the mortgage out of my paycheck every month and I didn't know. Silence. So how did you? And Diane Whitaker hung up the phone. Rachel sat there looking at the screen. Then she said, Dad. Yeah, they already went to her. She looked up. Miriam hasn't filed anything. Nobody's called anybody. And they already went to her. And I said out loud in my kitchen, then it wasn't us. What? I stood up so fast the chair went over. Rachel, it was never us. Somebody's been running at this from the other end since November. I was already reaching for the phone. Vanessa called his job on the 9th of December. Ray got warned before the 2nd of January. Federal agents were at Diane's door on the 4th. Honey, that's not our case. Our case is 41 pages in Miriam's safe. Then whose? And I stopped, because I finally saw it. Standing in my kitchen at 7:56 at night on the 4th of January, I saw the shape of the thing I'd been staring at since the first hour since the legal pad, since he isn't afraid. Ethan wasn't afraid of Rachel finding out. He'd never once been afraid of Rachel. He was afraid of Cascade Pacific. Marcus said it in the parking garage on the 12th of November, and I heard it and I didn't listen. He said 2 of the 3 times he'd seen that name, somebody went to federal prison. 2 out of 3. Because Cascade Pacific wasn't a company that got fooled by Ethan Whitaker. Cascade Pacific was a company Ethan Whitaker was working for. He didn't forge my daughter's name to steal from my daughter. He forged my daughter's name because somebody needed paper. And the third refinance in that email, how fast can we get the third one done? That wasn't a man getting greedy. That was a man with a deadline. I said, Rachel, get me Marcus. Dad, what? Get me Marcus now. He picked up on the first ring, which he never does, and before I said one word, Marcus Webb said, Sam, I've been calling you for an hour. Where's your phone? Marcus. Sam, shut up and listen. And I heard something in his voice I had never heard in 30 years. Not at homicides, not at the hospital, not at Elaine's funeral. Cascade Pacific funding went into receivership this morning. Assets frozen. There's a federal task force on it, and it's not new. Sam, it's 19 months old. I couldn't speak. Sam, your son-in-law's not a suspect, Marcus said. What? He's not a suspect, Marcus said. He's inventory. He's one of about 40 names in a file, and the only thing that makes him different is that he's the only one who threw a 6-year-old out on a porch to buy himself a signature. And I stood in my kitchen and heard myself say the stupidest, smallest, most honest sentence of my whole life. Marcus, then who's coming for him? And Marcus Webb said, Sam, they already came. Ethan was picked up at 4 o'clock this afternoon. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'd been standing in a gas station in Oregon City at 10 that morning telling Miriam Okafor I might have blown the whole thing, and while I was driving home breaking speed limits, 2 men in a gray sedan were putting my son-in-law in the back seat outside a regional operations office in Beaverton, and nobody on earth thought to call me because I wasn't anybody. I wasn't the case. I was just the grandfather. I said, Marcus, say that again. 4 o'clock. Federal warrant. Sam, it's not about your daughter. Your daughter's name is in that file exactly 1 time, and it's on a page as a victim. And I stood in my kitchen, and I felt, and I've thought about this 1,000 times since, and I still can't defend it. I felt robbed. 54 days. 36 pages. A legal pad at 3 in the morning. A woman I'd made sit down at a public counter in Salem. And in the end, somebody with a badge and a task force and 19 months of wiretaps reached down and took him off the board like he was nothing, and I hadn't laid a finger on it. Rachel was watching my face. She said, "Dad, what?" And I said, "They arrested him." 8:01 in the evening, 4th of January. My daughter put both hands over her mouth. She didn't make a sound. And then she said through her hands, "Where's Noah?" Not is he okay, not what happens now. Where's Noah? That's the difference between us. I'll be honest about that for the rest of my life. He was in the front room with a movie on, and Rachel went in there and sat down on the floor next to him and put her arm around him and watched a cartoon for 40 minutes, and I stood in my kitchen with a phone in my hand and a chair on the floor where I'd knocked it over. At 9, she came back out and said, "You're mad." I'm not mad. "Dad." She sat down. "You're furious and you don't know who at." And I said, "I did all that work." And my daughter looked at me and said, "Yeah. And it didn't matter, Rachel. They had him in a file since before I knew his middle name." "Dad?" She reached across and took the phone out of my hand and set it down. "They had 40 names in a file. You know why Ethan's the one in the back of the car tonight and not name 39? I didn't answer. "Because a woman called his job on the 9th of December, she said. And that woman called because she opened a garbage bag in a garage and found dinosaurs. And Dad, you're the one who told me on your porch that the door opening 6 inches was the whole story." I said, "That's not the same." "It's exactly the same," she said. "You didn't put him in the car. You put the Y in the file." Miriam called at 9:30, and I said, "Was it me, on Ray's porch? Did I?" And Miriam said, "Sam, stop it. He'd been under a warrant since the 22nd of December. Your little visit to Milwaukee moved nothing. You're not the weather." I said, "Then what am I?" And Miriam Okafor said, "You're the only person in this whole thing who ever asked why a man wasn't afraid. He was out in 6 days. Of course he was. That's the part people don't understand, and it makes them angry. And I understand why it makes them angry, and it's still how it works. Non-violent. No record. Ankle monitor passport. Surrendered live with a family member. The family member was Diane. They put him back in his mother's house. Rachel took that news standing at my sink washing a pan, and she said, "Good." I said, "Good." And she said, "Dad, those two are going to sit in that house together for 14 months, waiting to find out which one of them the government believes." She was right. She was right in a way I wouldn't fully see for a year. Now, here's the thing that broke my heart, and it wasn't the case. It was that Noah asked about him. On the 11th of January at bedtime, with the little lamp on, because that lamp never went off. Not once. Not for 8 months. My grandson said, "Grandpa is Dad in jail." And I'd made a promise in a hallway. So I sat on the edge of that bed, 68 years old, and I said, "Some of it's grown-up stuff, and I'm not going to explain all of it tonight. But he did something wrong with money and papers, and there's going to be a judge, and it's going to take a long time, and it's not about you." He thought about that. Then he said, "Is he in trouble because of the door?" And I sat there. I could have said yes. God, I wanted to say yes. There is a version of me that says yes and lets a 6-year-old carry a clean, satisfying story for the rest of his life. I said nobody. He's not in trouble for the door. Nobody goes to jail for the door. And Noah said, "Then who's in trouble for the door?" 8:40 at night, 11th of January. And I said, "Me, I am. I'm the one who's mad about the door. That's my job. You don't have to be in charge of that." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Okay," and rolled over and went to sleep in 11 minutes, and it was the first night since November he didn't wake up at 2. I don't know what that means. I'm not a psychologist. I've thought about it maybe 400 times. I think he'd been carrying it. And he was 6. And he needed somebody to say, "Put it down, I've got it. I've got..." The federal case took 11 months, and I'm not going to walk you through it because federal cases are the most boring catastrophes on earth. It's paper. It's continuances. It's a man in a suit asking for another 60 days and getting them. But there was a day. There was one day. The 19th of October in a courtroom in Portland, and Ray Delaney sat in a witness chair and told them everything. He'd taken a deal in April. Of course he had. He was 69. And I want to tell you what he said, because it's the only part of that entire year that I couldn't have predicted. The prosecutor asked him how it started. And Ray sat there in a suit that didn't fit anymore, and he said, "Sam Brooks sent him to me." Rachel's hand closed on my wrist so hard I had a mark. He came in 2014, and he said he was Sam's son-in-law, and I did the loan clean, and I did it right, and I didn't charge them a dime over. And then, in 2019, my company folded, and I went to Cascade because they'd take anybody, and in 2023, that kid called me and said he had a problem, and did I remember him? The prosecutor said, "And what did you say?" And Ray Delaney said, "I said, Sam Brooks's kid doesn't have problems." Silence in that room. And he laughed, Ray said. He laughed and he said, "Ray Sam Brooks isn't anybody's problem anymore. He's a guy in a house on the coast." And Ray Delaney looked at me across a federal courtroom, and he said to the prosecutor, but not to the prosecutor. And I believed him. That's the whole thing. That's my entire crime if you want it in one sentence. Ethan Whitaker told me Sam Brooks was finished, and I believed him because I was finished, so it seemed reasonable. Rachel let go of my wrist. 11:40 in the morning, 19th of October. And I sat in that room and understood finally why Ethan Whitaker had never been afraid. He wasn't unafraid because he was smart. He was unafraid because everybody had agreed I was over, including me. I'd agreed first. I'd moved to a town with no traffic lights and fixed a roof badly and called it peace. He took the plea on the 6th of December. 61 months. Diane pled to a misdemeanor and got probation and a fine. And I want to be honest, that one sat in me like a stone for about a year, and then one day it didn't, and I'll tell you why in a minute. The house came back to Rachel in the civil case in February. Not the money. There was no money. There was never going to be money. The money went where money goes, which is into a boat and a Lexus and a firm in Nevada, and then into nothing at all. But the deed was hers, clean, and the fraudulent notes were voided, and she sold it in April for $261,000 and never once drove past it. Vanessa Reyes testified for 2 hours and 40 minutes and then went back to Gresham, and I have never seen her again. She sent Noah a card that Christmas. No return address. It said, "I'm sorry, and you seem like a great kid." Rachel read it twice and then put it in a drawer and kept it, and when I asked her why, she said, "Because someday he's going to want to know that somebody was on his side who didn't have to be." Outside the courthouse in December, there were cameras because there's always cameras. And Diane Whitaker walked up to a reporter and said loud, "That man destroyed my family," and pointed at me, and every lens turned around. And Rachel started to move, and I put a hand on her arm. The reporter said, "Sir, do you have a response?" And I stood there. And here's the truth. I had a response. I'd had it since 3 in the morning on the 12th of November. I'd built it. I'd polished it. I had a sentence that would have taken that woman apart on the 6 o'clock news in front of the entire state of Oregon, and it was good, and I'd earned it, and it was sitting right there in my mouth. And I looked past that reporter, and my grandson was standing by the car with my daughter's hand on his shoulder. 7 years old by then, watching me, waiting to find out what a man does. And I said, "No, I don't have a response." And I walked to my car. That's it. That's the whole thing. That's the sentence I gave the 6 o'clock news. Rachel didn't say anything until we were on the highway. Then she said, "Dad, you had one. I could see it on your face." And I said, "Yeah. What was it?" And I said, "Honey, I'm going to take it to the grave because the second I say it out loud, it stops being a thing I didn't do." He came to my house on the 8th of April, 3 years later. I want to be exact about this because it's the last thing that happened, and it's the only part anybody ever asks about. 2:15 in the afternoon. He'd been out 5 weeks. Halfway house in Portland, and he'd taken 2 buses and a shuttle, and then walked the last mile and a half in the rain, which I'll give him. This is 110 miles of effort, and he did it without telling anybody. and he showed up at my door, soaked. Standing on my porch, in the rain. I want you to sit with that for a second because I did. I stood in my hallway with my hand on the doorknob, and I looked at Ethan Whitaker standing in the rain on my porch, and I thought about a 6-year-old with his fists on a door. And for about 4 seconds, I understood every man I ever arrested. Then I opened it. I didn't do it because I'm good. I want that clear. I did it because I'd promised a kid in a hallway that I don't lie. And if I'd left that man in the rain, I would have had to explain to myself for the rest of my life why 40 minutes was a monstrous thing when he did it, and a righteous thing when I did it. 40 minutes is 40 minutes. Either the number means something, or it never did. He came in. He stood in my kitchen dripping, and he didn't sit down. He said, "Is Noah here?" "No." "Is Rachel?" "Ethan." I put a towel on the counter. "Nobody's here. Say what you came to say." He said, "I don't have a speech." "Good. I've heard 400 speeches. Every one of them was a lie, and half the guys giving them didn't know it." And he stood there in my kitchen, and he was 39 years old, and he had gray in his hair that he did not have 3 years ago, and he said, "I told myself he wouldn't remember." 2:21 in the afternoon. "That's it," he said. "That's the whole thing. That's what I've got. I sat in there for 38 months, and I kept turning it over, trying to find the part where I was a monster, and I couldn't find it. And then in the second year, I found it, and it was that." He was 6. I did the math. I thought kids don't remember before 7. I looked it up, Sam. I looked it up on my phone. I didn't say anything. "So it was free," he said. "I thought it was free." And I said, "When did you look it up?" He looked at me. "Before or after?" I said. And Ethan Whitaker said before. And there it was. 3 years and 11 months and a federal case and a folder from a woman in Gresham. And there it finally was, the whole man standing in my kitchen, saying it himself, with nobody making him. He said, "I know what that is." "Do you?" "Yeah," his voice went. "It's premeditation." I said, "It's worse than that, son. Premeditation's just planning. What you did was you sat down and you priced him. You put a number on your kid, and the number came back low, and you went ahead." And Ethan Whitaker stood in my kitchen and cried, and I let him, and I did not put a hand on his shoulder, and I have never once regretted that. When he was done, he said, "What do I do?" And this is the part people always want. This is the part where I'm supposed to forgive him. I'm not going to lie to you. I said, "Ethan, look at me. I don't forgive you. I want you to hear that clean because people are going to tell you I did, and they'll be being nice, and nice is the enemy here. I don't forgive you. That's not mine to give, and I'm not big enough anyway." He nodded. He'd expected it. "But I'm going to give you something worse," I said. "I'm going to give you the truth, and then you have to carry it, and there's no bottom to it, so you'd better find something to do with your hands." He said, "Okay." And I said, "You can't erase the night you locked that door. It's in him. It's in there forever, and there's no version of this where you take it out. That's not a punishment, that's just a fact like weather. But that door is not the last thing you get to be." He said, "He's 10. "He's 10, I said. "He's got 60, 70 years of remembering you left in him, and right now the door is the whole file. It's the only page. So you get to spend the rest of your life deciding whether it stays the only page, or whether it turns out to be the first one." He said, "What if she never lets me?" "Then you do it anyway," I said. "That's the deal. You don't get to make it conditional. You don't get to do 3 years of good behavior and then send a bill. You do it into the dark, and you never find out if it worked, and you do it anyway. And if that sounds unbearable, well..." I picked up his towel off the counter. "That's what she did for 6 years while you were building your file." He stood there. Then he said, "Sam, why'd you open the door?" And I said, "Because I'm not you." He left. He walked back out into it. And I watched him from my window until he was gone off the end of my road. And then I sat down at my kitchen table. And I'm going to tell you something. I've told exactly one person. I shook for about 20 minutes. Because it turns out the hardest thing I ever did in 31 years of homicide, and 1 year of this was open a door for a man who deserved to stand in the rain. Rachel bought her own house that summer, 19 minutes from mine. 3 bedrooms, a bad roof, and she fixed the roof herself badly, and I have never in my life been prouder of a bad roof. She went back to teaching that fall. 2nd grade, same as ever. And in her first week, she had a kid in her class who wouldn't take his coat off, and she called me at 10 at night and said, "Dad, he won't take his coat off." And she was crying, and I said, "Honey, that's not him." And she said, I know it's not. But I know what the code is now, and I didn't before, and Dad, I'm going to know it every year for the rest of my career. That's the cost. Nobody tells you that part. You don't get put back the way you were. You get put back better, and better is heavier. Noah started leaving his bedroom door open when he was 9. Not the lamp. The lamp took until he was 11. He plays baseball badly with enormous enthusiasm, and he still lines his things up in an order, and he still won't say what the order means, and I've stopped asking. He sees his father 4 times a year supervised at Rachel's insistence and against my advice, and she was right and I was wrong, and I've told her so. And last spring he asked me out of nowhere in my truck, "Grandpa, why'd you let him in your house that time?" I said, "How do you know about that?" And my grandson said, "Mom told me. She said you stood in the hallway for a really long time first." So she'd seen it. Somehow she'd seen it. I still don't know how. I said, "Yeah, I did." And Noah said, "Why?" And I said, "Because a door's a serious thing, bud. It's the most serious thing there is. You only get to be somebody who doesn't do that, or somebody who does." He thought about it for about a mile. Then he said, "That's kind of the whole thing, isn't it?" 11 years old. Yeah, that's kind of the whole thing. People ask me if it was worth it. They ask if I got justice, like justice is an object, like it's something you carry out of a building. I didn't put Ethan Whitaker in prison. A task force did that, and they'd have done it without me, and I've made my peace with it. I didn't get the money back. There wasn't any. I didn't get an apology from Diane, and I never will. And the day I stopped needing one was the day I found out she'd sold her house to pay her fine, and moved into an apartment where her son sleeps on the couch, and those two are going to sit across from each other for the rest of their lives, knowing exactly what they each did. And there is nothing I could have said to a reporter that comes within a country mile of that. Here's what I got. I got a daughter who reads what's on the page now. I got a grandson who sleeps with the door open. I got a Tuesday last month where the 3 of us ate dinner at her table, and nobody flinched when somebody knocked, and it was a kid selling raffle tickets, and Noah answered it himself. He answered it himself. They tell you revenge is about making them fall. It isn't. I watched him fall, and I felt nothing at all, and that surprised me, and it took me 3 years to understand why. Because a man like Ethan doesn't destroy you by taking your money or your house or your name on a piece of paper. He destroys you by making you into somebody who locks doors. He didn't get that. That's the one thing in this whole story he reached for and didn't get. He locked my family out of a house in Beaverton on the 11th of November, and every single door in my life has been open ever since.